still can't hear me? I think it's on, right? Check one. All right, this is where we're testing. Okay. Carry on. Okay. So, what did the grape say when the gorilla sat on it? This isn't adjusting the levels talking. It has nothing to do with anything. I'm just talking so that Robert can adjust the levels. What did the grape say when the gorilla sat on it? What did the grape say? It's not when the gorilla sat on it.
The grape sat on the gorilla?
Jerry, don't make this any harder than it has to be.
It's better be funny. I mean,
We've already ruined it. There's too many questions. The joke is ruined. But the answer is nothing. He just let out a little whine. I didn't say it'd be good. I was just, yeah, there we go. So, all right, so it's on now. McMeans's, can you hear me in the very back? Tim Packer, am I somewhat audible? No? I think you're just being difficult. Is that correct? Okay. Anna Lauren, can you hear me? Brian Gamble, can you hear me? Praise God. Okay. Welcome to Theology on Tap, the final and fourth session for the 2022 series. Thank you for braving this winter weather. I mean, if you've ever wondered what Antarctica feels like, it's not this. But in Waco, this is close enough for us. So thank you for being here. I'm excited as we conclude the problem of evil. One of the things that we've seen about this series is that there's different ways to address this question. At Theology on Tap, we're interested in getting people together in a casual environment with giant pigs painted on the wall and asking the deep questions of life. And one of the things that everybody has personal experience with is suffering. And everybody has asked this question in life. And so some of our speakers have come at it from a very philosophical angle. Some people have come at it from a biblical or theological angle. Some people have come at it from a societal, anthropological angle. And tonight, finally, Hilary Yancey will solve the problem for us. And I will, you'll get to hear from her. She's an Episcopalian. She is a professor at Baylor. She is a mother, a spouse, and lots of other things. And I'm going to welcome Dr. Rachel Toombs, her close personal friend, to talk about Hilary Yancey and her book, Forgiving God, and anything else you might need to know about her before we turn it over to her. And this is going to continue to move, so I've been working out. Let's see if I can do this. All right.
John Wood just fixed this for me. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out in the cold. As a Minnesotan, it makes me very proud. I am delighted. I've gotten to introduce a number of people that I really respect, but tonight I get to introduce someone that I really love. A lot. So I want to introduce you to my friend and philosopher and brilliant woman, Dr. Hilary Yancey. Some of you were in a small group that read her book, Forgiving God, which I would highly recommend. She got her PhD in philosophy from Baylor. She wrote on Aristotle, so she likes the kind of philosophy that overwhelms me and I don't know what to do with. And tonight she's going to talk about the philosophy of disability as it relates to what we deem evil or not. It's actually a really nice segue from last week. So let us introduce Dr. Hilary Yancey.
All right. Hi. Can everybody hear me okay? We're good? In the back, do you need me to go up or I can't, the thumbs up? Okay, good. There. Multiple signs. Thank you. I appreciate that. So, as my dear friend Rachel said, I am a philosopher by training, and so what this means for you all is that I'm going to proceed a little bit more Socratically. He's sort of the founder of what we all do, and so I'm following a little bit in his spirit. So I'm not going to talk for an excessively long period of time, and I hope that what I'm going to do is provoke you to ask some questions, to think about things in a slightly different way. And then you're going to turn on me, as almost all of Socrates' friends did, and you're going to ask me the hardest questions you can possibly think of. I will not have the answers. I'm so sorry, Father Aaron. But I hope that we get it wrong in a slightly better way at the end of this talk than we did when we were starting. So, let's get started. I started with someone that I'm actually going to quibble with a little bit. But St. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come? Fool, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And as for what you sow, you do not sow the body that is to be, but a bare seed, perhaps of wheat or of some other grain. Well, my apologies to St. Paul, but I am going to ask some questions about the kinds of bodies that might be raised in the resurrection. And I'm going to do that because I think speculating carefully and well about that question changes what we think the church should be doing now. So let me give you a little outline of where I'm going, and then we'll get started. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give my understanding of the motivation of the problem that we're thinking about tonight. So I'm going to ask the question, why would there be a topic like disability and the problem of evil? Then I'm going to give us a little bit of a challenge from some evidence that comes from a few different places. One, from the testimony of individuals who have disabilities, and from more statistical surveys and other kinds of data that we gather about disability and quality of life. Then I'm going to give you a short discourse on something called the mere difference view of disability that shows up primarily in the philosophy that I read. And then I'm going to give us a thought about where this could, and I'm going to say should, lead the church. Okay, so here's the motivating problem. It seems to a lot of us like living with a disability is intuitively bad, right? This might not seem surprising, and it's certainly not necessarily a thought that occurs to everyone, but it seems fairly intuitive to us that it causes suffering, that it causes your life to be harder in some substantial way, that if someone tells me they're disabled, or if I tell someone, as some of you know from my book, that my son is disabled, they kind of come to think, oh, well, I know something about how that life might be. And I think, that life's harder than a non-disabled life, right? It would go easier for my son. It would be better for him if he didn't have those disabilities. And most cases of disability, we also tend to think, are not caused by the deliberate, intentional action of a human agent. And this is where that distinction, maybe you've heard of it, maybe not, of the difference between moral evil and natural evil would come into play. So, in case you're not familiar, moral evil are those things that are perpetrated by agents. There's some level of intentional infliction of harm or damage, oppression or injustice. That's moral evil. Now that poses a problem for God too, but we have a different kind of set of explanations available to us when we think about those kinds of things. The other kind, the kind that's often really hard to reconcile with God's goodness and power, is what we might call natural evil. Think about tsunamis or earthquakes, things that happen without having some particular human to blame for them. It's clear that tsunamis or earthquakes or forest fires wreak incredible amounts of suffering, right? Pain, loss of livelihood, loss of property, loss of life. And it kind of seems to us, I think, again, intuitively, like, well, who could we hold responsible for that? I mean, maybe just God? Maybe God is the agent we can say has both the power to do something different and would have a good reason to do something different. And that's sort of where the case for natural evil or the problem of it gets going, because we have to ask, how do we reconcile God's goodness, his power to do something different, and his stated interests in our good and things going well for us, in our happiness, in our flourishing? How do those things reconcile with the stuff that happens that we can't hold another moral agent responsible for? So if we put these together, disabilities seem like the kinds of things that are not caused, or at least not all of them, by intentional, deliberate human actions. And in the cases of natural evil, we tend to think, well, God could have done something different. Why didn't God do something different in this case, right? I can tell you very briefly that I asked this question when I was pregnant with my son. I asked the question, if God can really do something different, and he could make my son's life go better for him by miraculously healing him, right? Now he's not going to have the disabilities he has. Why wouldn't God do that? Okay, so you see where the problem's sort of going? We're asking, God has the power to do it, and God seems to have good reasons to do it. And in the case of disability, we're coupling that with the assumption that seems really intuitive, I'm guessing, to a lot of us, that disabilities are the kinds of things that make a life go worse. So that's where we get this problem. Okay. So now we're going to get to the challenge, the thing about the evidence in question. So let's just start with a question. When you think about how your life is going, how flourishing it is, how happy you are, how well you are, in the most robust sense. I won't pull out the Aristotelian terminology, but it's eudaimonia for anybody who really needed to know. How would we know how somebody's life is going? How do you know how your life is going? Probably do some internal reflection, right? You think about how you feel about your life, or you think about the things that are in your life, the events, the people, the relationships, the community, the church, your job. You think about maybe your past and what kinds of stories you bring with you. And all of that goes into your sense of your well-being, right? So I think when we think about other people's well-being, there's sort of two sources of evidence, at least two, and these are the two I'll think about. So one would be the external facts, right? So we know so-and-so lives in a certain place, or that they're married or not. We know maybe what job they have. We know maybe something about their sort of bodily condition, their socioeconomic status, their sexual orientation, their race. We could learn those sorts of external facts. And then we have their testimony, right? Now, this is not going to apply in all cases of disability. We don't have access to the testimony of every disabled individual for a variety of reasons, some of which are that disability is a hugely diverse group. In philosophy, we are tending to say there might not even be one thing that kind of captures what all people who have disabilities or what all disabled people have in common. But we know that we're trying to get at some truth about people whose bodies and whose minds and whose spirits are at least a little bit different than what is typical or what is common. So it's not true in all cases that we've got testimony, but we do have it about a lot of things, right? We have it about people, for example, who live with cystic fibrosis or who are paraplegic. We might have it about people who are deaf. We might have it about people who are blind, because they themselves can tell us something about how their life is going, and more particularly, they can tell us how the bodily condition that they have, that they might identify as being a part of who they are, interacts with the rest of their life. How does it contribute to how their life is going? I put in a parenthetical, if you think of other things that we might be able to draw on to get evidence about well-being, I'd love to know. So we can learn, so in the example of disability, we think about it this way. We can learn that someone has a disability, right? We might be able to either see it, we might learn it through some other external means, but we can learn the fact of it. But then we have to listen to get another really important source of evidence, which is, how does that person see this same bodily condition? How does this condition interact with the rest of their life, their environment, their relationships, their community? Okay. Harriet McBride Johnson was a disability advocate who was in a very interesting philosophical discussion for years with Peter Singer. And I don't know if any of you know who Peter Singer is. He's an animal rights activist and a very sort of let's just say he took a very different view of disabilities than disability advocates did. She opens this New York Times piece from 2003 that's behind me. I hope I'm not blocking it too much. Actually by saying that he doesn't wish that she was dead, but he thinks it would have been better on the whole if someone with her condition hadn't been born. And she had a friendship with this person, which is really beautiful and fascinating to think about, and I encourage you to read the whole article that this is cited from. But what she says, and this is just an example, one of many, she says, I used to try to explain that in fact I enjoy my life, that it's a great sensual pleasure to zoom by power chair on these delicious muggy streets. Okay, so I hope this is already flying in the face of what you might have intuited if you knew that she lived with a wheelchair, that she was wheelchair bound, something that we say. What is she saying here? She's saying that this is actually a pleasurable, enriching part of her life. Okay. So her testimony, I hope, at this moment is starting to challenge what we might have assumed by learning an external fact about her, and what we might have concluded based on that external fact alone. We might have thought, intuitively, she's worse off for being in a power chair. And she's saying, no, I'm not worse off. My life is different. In this case in particular, she's saying she might actually have a very unique kind of sensory experience in the world, one that we, who are not in a power chair, don't have access to. It's just something interesting to think about. Similarly to this, a very often cited sort of body of reflection would come from the deaf community. And that might be something that more of you are familiar with, that the deaf community talks often about the way that sign language unites them as a community, that it is a unique, embodied experience. They don't experience their life as being absent of hearing, but being as full of what it is to be deaf. They, not all, but many of them claim this actually as a source of pride, as a source of identity, recognizing themselves as themselves. And so there, again, we who are hearing, I'm not assuming anyone in this room is, but those of us who are might say to ourselves, right? This would be kind of a first run at a reasoning we might take. We might say, well, there's a real good in hearing music, right? It's beautiful. Or hearing people's voices that we love. It would be bad not to do that. It would be bad not to hear that. So if you're deaf, you're worse off than me because you don't access these goods. It would be better for you if you could hear. It would be better for you if God restored your hearing. But then when we talk to the actual people in this community, they're telling us, actually, we don't need to reconcile our deafness with God's goodness because our deafness is an expression of God's goodness, actually, right? So rather than solving the problem of evil by giving a complicated philosophical explanation, we actually just say, oh, the problem might not exist here, at least not in the way that we thought. Okay, so what this testimony does and doesn't suggest. Now, I think this testimony is suggesting that disability is not always or not necessarily bad for you. So, as I was just saying, they might not be instances of evil in the way we typically think about them. So we don't need to explain them, right? They fall away from this problem that you all have been talking about for a month. They fall away because actually we expand our imaginations to see disabilities as expressions of God's goodness and as expressions of the diversity of human life rather than as something to be explained or justified in relationship to God. Now, given that it's not always or not necessarily bad for you, I do want to move to part 3, the mere difference view of disability, because this carries, I think, a really important caveat. So Elizabeth Barnes is a philosopher who does quite a lot of disability work. She is something of a personal hero of mine. And I can tell you once about the time that I got to meet her in which I was horribly tongue-tied. And she was very gracious. She puts forward in her 2016 book, The Minority Body, what she calls a value-neutral model of disability, where she basically says, look, when you think about disability by itself, or when we think about that external fact I was just talking about, right, that you learn that someone has a disability or is disabled, you don't learn an extra fact about them. You learn that they have a disability, but you don't learn any extra facts about how well their life is going. You don't learn that their life is worse. You don't always learn that their life is better. You actually just learn that their life is different. It's merely different. Okay. This view is compatible with the very real embodied experience that sometimes in some contexts, in some environments, in some relationships, being disabled is a harm. It's a more restricted harm. It can be a harm because your environment is inaccessible, or because people are discriminatory, or because systems are unjust. Now, that doesn't mean that being disabled is bad for you. It means that being disabled in some contexts and in some environments makes your life harder or makes it more complicated. And that's true of all kinds of conditions, right? All kinds of ways of being embodied can, in different environments, make life go harder for you. And I'll just use one example. So I'm a woman, and it's generally, I think, known to be true that there are some things that go harder for me because of that, right? But it would be very strange to conclude on the basis of learning that I'm a woman that my life is worse than if I were a man, right? Even though we know that it's true, even statistically, right? I probably don't get paid in some contexts as much as my male counterparts, or I might face kinds of discrimination in hiring or in academia or in other contexts that my male counterparts wouldn't face. We know that's true, but we don't think my life is worse because of that. So my suggestion is disability has something similar going on, right? We learn that someone has a disability, but not what that means. Okay. So it's obvious, I think, that we are still going to wrestle. I promised I was not going to solve the problem of evil for you. We're going to wrestle with God's goodness and the world that we live in. But I want us to expand our imaginations a little bit. I want us to think about the ways of being in the world that we might conclude are worse just because they're less typical, just because our world is insufficiently accessible or insufficiently just. And in those contexts, I want us to say, it might not be a problem of evil. It might be a problem of what we need to do to shape a world in which this expression, this embodied expression of the image of God can flourish. Okay. I'm in my last section. I'm so excited, nervous for everything that y'all are going to say to me after. Okay, so I am wary of Paul's admonition about speculating about the resurrected body. I don't think St. Paul would mind, though. Okay, I think I'm good. I don't think St. Paul would mind us reflecting carefully, at least in an imaginative capacity. Okay, could it be that disability exists in the resurrected life? Let me give you just two reasons. One, directly related to what I've just said. What if disability is not a way that your life goes worse, but is just a way of being in the world? And connected to that, what if it's a way of being known in the world? So part of how I recognize my son as the particular person that he is because of the body that he has. I don't wish that to be different. Now, I'm waiting to hear from my son how his life is going. I'm waiting to learn from him what it has been like to be in the body that he has. But in the meantime, I want to work to make the world as maximally just as possible for him so that his way of being in the world, his body, his embodiment, is not so challenged, is not so fraught, it's not so difficult. And if it's possible that disability exists in the resurrection, in part because of how we are known and how we know others, how we recognize others as themselves, how we know us as ourselves, and the church is supposed to be something like a reflection of heavenly reality now, then what should be the case about our churches? What should be the case about how accessible they are physically? What should be the case about how worship might look to include and embrace as fully as we possibly could those whose embodiment is different? Those are the questions. Those are the thoughts. Thank you very much. I think this fell down. Oh, sorry. What? Okay. Sorry the mic fell down. I hope you could all still hear me.
All right, you will find on your tables possibly no cards. Many of you have been through this before. But if you have questions that are either too complicated or you are too shy to ask, just raise them up and we will send... Neil, do you want to be our runner? Sure. We will just fly them in the air and Neil will come and grab them. Otherwise, we can just take questions from you. But as you think about it, I think I have a question.
Oh, no.
If someone who experiences some kind of disability says it is a life of suffering, are they allowed to call it evil?
I think so. I think that's part of why the testimony is so important, because the mere difference view doesn't require that disability be a thing that is always good for you, right? It only requires that when we learn the fact of a disability, we ask a further question about how that disability interacts with a life. Now, I think it's trickier with disabilities that seem at least partially constituted by pain and suffering. And some of the questions is whether or not it's possible to sort of separate out the disability from the pain in all those cases. Thanks for picking definitely the hardest follow-up question. But I think, yes, I think part of what I'm hoping on this view is that we're able to encompass the wide variety of experience of disability rather than make conclusions actually in one direction or the other.
We're just not in the place to make that call.
Right.
I see that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking, Jennifer Aniston was in that movie a few years back with the chronic pain. Does anyone know the movie I'm talking about? Yeah. What was it called?
Friends?
No. No, not Friends. But it was a really powerful movie because chronic pain is a very distinct kind of bodily experience. And it's a haunting movie, kind of living that with her.
And Oh, go ahead.
No, you can follow up.
Oh, okay, just one last thing is that I think one of the things that is important to consider that we might not consider that often is the way that God interacts personally with these particular cases. And so I'm sort of fully of the view that there's some mystery in the conversation between any individual and God about their embodiment, but that God is attentive to that and to the way embodiment is shaping someone's life and reality in a way that we wouldn't be capable of.
Yeah. Great. Tim.
See if we can project my voice enough.
Okay.
The word disability is like the forefront to the dis bit, so the negation ability, or the
Yeah.
disability. Is it the right word, or what word should we use?
Oh, yeah, so this is a good question. So is it Tim?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. Rachel just told me to repeat the question. I sort of feel like I should hold this.
Let me help you, friend.
Okay, thanks. So Tim just asked whether disability is the right term because it implies, the absence of ability or the lack of ability, It's an inability or a disability. So again, this is where I think we should attend to the community of people who actually are the ones kind of reclaiming this terminology for themselves, and I think we need to ask. So here's a short example. I sort of alternated in my talk between using a term like people with disabilities, which is sometimes called person-first language, or saying disabled people. Different individuals in the community prefer different things. And so I think actually the thing to do is to learn what they might like. Some people wouldn't want the term disability to be used, or would say that what they would prefer is to make a stronger distinction between disability as it relates to sort of social environment, right, injustice, and the bodily condition that they have. Others would say, no, disability is a part of me. I want that term to be a part of how people know me. And I think it's something we, in grace and in kindness, learn about people.
It's the second time you've reiterated it's not up to us to decide, which is an interesting lesson. We have a lot of questions.
Okay.
The first question. Isn't there a difference between acquired, as in somebody's fault, versus congenital, versus which is nobody's fault when we think about people with disabilities?
So yes, there are distinctions between acquired disabilities and what we could say is our congenital disabilities. Sometimes that has to do with the cause. Acquired doesn't always mean that there is an intentional human agent, though. Acquired could be just a circumstance of life, right? You could acquire a disability over the course of exposure to radiation that's not the direct result of a human being or someone else exposing you to it. You could acquire a disability in the course of your work, because your work is a certain kind of dangerous activity that's, again, an accident. It's not the fault of a particular agent. So I wouldn't want the distinction to be between, here are the group of disabilities that sort of are natural evils because they're congenital, and here's the group that are moral evils or something because they're acquired. I think actually what happens when we think about the problem of evil, and if we are thinking about disabilities that may result from intentional inflicted harm, what we know for sure is we can say the intentional infliction of harm on another human being is evil. We know that, right? Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, there's consensus around that question. And so I don't think I don't think that creates a conflict with my view, in part because we can call the cause of the disability evil straightforwardly. Whether the disability itself has that feature because of its cause, I don't think is necessarily true, right? It could be that it's caused by evil, but it comes to be a part of someone's identity in a meaningful way, and that is a good, or at least a way of being different that turns out to be sort of neutral. And I think, again, it'll be sort of a little bit case by case, but I think we can say intentionally caused disabilities, that kind of intentional harm with the intent to harm, right? Yeah, that would be evil.
Good. All right. Ooh, okay, get ready.
Okay, I'm ready.
Could it be that human disabilities are from the fall, or since God is sovereign, he in fact brings them to be? So either it's a result of the fall, so our fall into sin, or if God is in fact sovereign over all things, that God intends different levels of ability, different kinds of ability.
Okay. Good. Good. This is good. Okay. So first, the first thing is what the fall is, what that is, and what it means. I will just confess is a little bit mysterious to me. In part because I think we're not given in Scripture a really clear list of exactly what all fell, what was caused by the fall, what wasn't. In terms, right, we're told about some curses that happen. We're told about things that will be different as a result of this having happened. But we're not told what kind of bodies everybody had. And I don't think we're not really given a description of Adam or Eve or these other characters as paradigmatic humans with particular bodily setups, right? That's not there. So is it possible that they had all what we might consider typical human abilities, sure. But I think it's also possible that there is a really wide expression of the image of God. Actually, that the image of God, we bear it because God said so, right? God said, this is going to bear my image, right? Human beings. But not because we have higher reason. I don't think that's very controversial, I know. All the Catholic forefathers from centuries ago are rolling over in heaven or something. But I think, so I don't know. I mean, truly, I don't know. I don't think so, though. I don't think that the fall caused them. I think it's the case that we are permitted to develop and to live with a little bit of creative uncertainty in the way the genome unfurls, in the way human lives go. And that certainly does seem to be a thing that God is okay with happening.
That God not only permits but seems to revel in and celebrate is the difference. You know, okay, I get to do this because I'm standing up here with the microphone. I was thinking about, so as you know, and some of you know, part of the dissertation I wrote, and the book will be out this summer. I'm not even kidding, it will be. But I write about Jacob's wrestling, right? And knowing you and your family as I was writing and rewriting some of that stuff and thinking about God found it fit that the blessing involved a limping. What is that a helpful reminder or an unhelpful one in what we think about the way our bodies should be and how God might desire them to look?
I mean, I think that's great. In part because I think God is so interested in the fact of our embodiment. That just like totally turn off. Yeah, it did. Well, okay, I'll just like, okay, now I can like walk around. God's so interested in the fact of our embodiment that God wrestles bodily with Jacob and marks Jacob bodily. That is a part of how Jacob's identity gets shaped, right? Like, it's not just new knowledge. It's not just a new name. It's a changed body. That you walk away from encounters with God changed in this physical, embodied way. So I think it's certainly an example of that, of God's care for that, of God's interest in that, of that not being something we're trying to escape, but actually something that we are invited to live more deeply into. I think that's tricky, though, too, right? So I'll leave it at that. I'm not answering that question. I can do that because she's my friend.
Oh, I have more. Oh, no, go ahead.
Sorry. It's the teacher in me.
Given your definition of disabilities, how do we distinguish those from the various diseases that we all get throughout our lives and various maladies, which we think anyone in this room would agree that we should cure as much as we can?
Yeah, good. So I think that's actually an interesting question. It's a smaller body of philosophical literature about the philosophy of illness and what illness is. I will say this. The concept of health is a very normatively laden concept, and it's one that is not really just rooted in science and facts, right? It's rooted in choices that we make about what we take a typical or a normal population to be. And when we test against that, when we say, right, for example, your heart pumps blood at a certain rate. Well, based on the reference class, it's going to change whether or not we think you have heart disease or hypertension, right? Because if we look at your reference class in relationship to, say, like all females of X ages, right, or all males of X ages, what is considered a normal rate of pumping blood in a human heart is actually going to be different. So there's no one kind of norm. So deviations from the norm, even in cases that we think might be straightforward, like you have X disease or you have Y condition, turn out to be a little tricky. which is not to say I think that all illnesses are like that, or that all diseases are like that. But I just want to sort of trouble the waters a little bit and point out that what we think health is, and especially the way we think of it as a known quantity that comes primarily from sort of just facts about human bodies, it's a little trickier than that. I think that one of the things we most care about, I hope is true in medicine, is that we want people to be capable of living well. And there are real ways in which certain diseases and illnesses acutely and intensely interfere with people's ability to live well, not necessarily with respect to things like injustice or lack of access or lack of services, but in something that interrupts how their life was going or could be going based on the body that they have, and that something about making them well involves taking that on. And so I think there's room in my view to say that we are able to address those things that are making or deliberately, I shouldn't say deliberately because they're not intentional agents, but things that are causing someone's life to not go well. But part of how we know what those things are is that people tell us what they are, right? And so we listen. We listen to the patient. We ask questions about whether their bodily situation is causing them the kind of suffering that interrupts the good life that we know we want them to live.
I guess just what I'm worried about, though, is that just as we are finite in our understanding of other people, so are people in giving their testimonies finite.
Sure, yeah. So that is completely true. We are not infallible with respect to our own well-being. There are definitely cases in which we would not be reliable testifiers about our own well-being. But I think in general, it's good to operate on a principle of trust when it comes to testimony like this, unless you have really good reason to think that somebody is unreliable about testifying about their own life. We should proceed that they know their own life. They know it better than we. They're at least better positioned than we are with respect to their own well-being. It doesn't mean they're infallible, and it doesn't mean their testimony couldn't be defeated in some meaningful sense by something else. But most often, they're at least better situated than we are. And so what I'm hoping I'm pushing forward is the idea that we're in a sort of position in which we need to trust, absent a really good reason, what people say about the relationship between their body and how they're living.
So we had, I don't know if you saw this, Hill, but we had Victoria Lee Austin come and answer the question, is the coronavirus evil, a few weeks ago? And one of, I think, the discomforts is that we want to make sure we attend to suffering. So as an example, I'm pretty sure most people in this room know someone or is someone who's experiencing long COVID, right? Like know someone who, even though COVID in its big sweep has come and gone in their life, they continue to have trouble breathing or working out or headaches, and life is no longer normal. And sometimes when we're pushing back against the normative, we want to undo the reality of the real suffering. How hard is it to both, it got very quiet, how hard is it both to affirm that the person who experiences the different kind of ability gets to decide quality, while also allowing that sometimes suffering is in the midst of it? Does that make sense? Like, how do we, you can be as specific as you want in that answer, but how do you, because you've written a lot on this, but you also know suffering. And so how do we balance both wanting to affirm the experience without sentimentalizing it in the process? And then I have a couple more questions.
Okay, so if I'm understanding your question right, you're asking something like, how do we both take seriously that people can sort of tell us how their life is going in relationship to something like a disability, and that suffering could be a part of that story.
It's going real bad.
Yeah. I mean, so I don't think that should trouble the view, because I think the view is really at its heart a view of asking for us to be a little bit more particular and less general with our conclusions, right? To be particular to how we see something within a person's life rather than something we apply kind of to them as a label or as an external thing that we know about them. I think we can and we do learn that disabilities make some people's lives incredibly difficult. And they are lives full of suffering. And I don't think that that's something to minimize at all. I don't think there should be any attempt to kind of make it okay or make it work. Be like, but actually, really, it's good, right? Like, right? Just in the same way that any kind of human experience that is an experience that contains part of suffering or is an experience of suffering that gets woven into the story of someone's life. We don't need to make it okay just because they are okay or just because their life overall, right, has these wonderful, beautiful things in it. The thread of suffering gets to run through the tapestry as what it is. And we see it for what it is. We're allowed to see it for what it is. But if you think about that metaphor, some people who know me know that I'm real big on metaphors. But if you see that thought of the life as a tapestry, right? Here are all of the threads of the things and the people and the communities and the relationships, the events. When you look at the tapestry, you might think you know what the threads of suffering are, what the threads of joy are, what the threads of happiness are, what the threads of hardship are. But actually, what we might need to do is say, tell me about your tapestry. Tell me about this thread. What is this thread like? And I think some of the time, the thread that is sort of the particular embodied experience is a thread of suffering. And sometimes it's a thread of joy. And sometimes it's a thread of kind of, it's not that it turns out not to be that definitive for their life at all, right? It might just be something that is true or is a fact, but they can say.
All right, 2 more, and then we should okay. Anna Lauren, I'll come to you in a second. Let me do this one, and I'll come to you. This is a good one. No, they're all very good. They're all very good. Since Jesus healed disabilities, restoring hearing and sight, a withered hand, it would seem to indicate God views those conditions as not ideal, and that I can't read your handwriting, that the whatever is happening with the disabilities is not ideal. So what do we make of the fact that Jesus deemed fit to heal things that we would regularly call disabilities?
Oh my gosh, thank you whoever asked that question. I love this question. I wrote a whole paper on it, in part because I think it's maybe one of the most common kind of troubling things when you take a view like mine is, well, it looks like Jesus was really interested in like eliminating blindness or eliminating deafness. But I think when we attend to these stories, a few things emerge. One is that Jesus is incredibly personally interactive with these individuals. And often, Jesus asks, what do you want? And they respond, I want to be healed. I want my sight. I want to be, right? I want to not have this condition. Okay, so that's one thing. That's not always the case. That won't explain everything. Far be it from me to explain the Lord's activities. But that is one thing I notice when I attend to these stories in scriptures, that there is this interesting, consistent way that Jesus gets personal and particular with people in just the way that I'm suggesting we should. That their volition, their desires are part of how Jesus chooses what Jesus does. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is we might ask ourselves, what is the context of disability in the life and the environment of Jesus's earthly ministry, right? What kind of social stigma would have been attached to someone with leprosy? What kind of spiritual stigma would have been attached to that person? They would have been prevented from certain kinds of religious activity. They would have been shunned from their community life. And it might be the case, I want to suggest, I think it very likely could be the case. And there's some interesting, if you read my paper, I have lots more sources to talk about this that are not at the top of my mind. But I think there's good reason to think that part of the healing activity involves the social situation and the restoration to community that could not have been possible without the elimination of a certain condition, right? Without the elimination of the leprosy, at least in the context in which Jesus is working. This person can't be restored in that way. And then we might ask ourselves, so is all that Jesus is doing changing something about the body, or is what Jesus is doing bringing that person back into a different kind of relationship with their community, which had their community perhaps had a different understanding or a different way of operating, it wouldn't have been necessary.
I wondered if you could comment on our addiction to independence and how it interplays with disability and what it does to the body of Christ when someone has a disability.
Yeah, okay. I have a paper about this too. I have not finished it. You can tell I really love this stuff. What? So the question is about what is it, Anna Lauren? Anna Lauren so beautifully said it's something like our addiction to independence. How does our interest in being independent, and even maybe how we think independence, what it is and how it operates, how does that influence our view of disability, and then how might disability then in turn kind of influence or be present in the body of Christ? Okay, so I think we have a little bit of a prejudice against modes of functioning that involve reliance of any kind on anything, right? We like to do things for ourselves, by ourselves, and we tend to think ourselves involves this barrier of our skin, right? And so this is not a part of me. My watch is not a part of me, but my fingers are, my toes are, right? So we tend to have this view. If it's not part of this physical body, then it's an aid in some way. I'm dependent on it. But I kind of think that's a prejudice. I don't think it's actually any worse to be reliant on something in order to function. I think that's just a different way of functioning. But if we were to sort of switch the kaleidoscope and ask more, how functionally successful is someone at X? Without asking how do they do it in the sense of like, do they do it by themselves or do they do it with help? Actually, that's the more interesting and relevant question, right? So here's a basic animal thing. Animals tend, not all animals, but lots of animals tend to locomote, right? They move around. We tend to think, oh, human beings are supposed to walk around like this, right? On legs. That's the way we do it. If you don't do it like that, you're doing it in a worse way, or you're doing it in a less good way because it's not sort of the normal way. But I tend to think, but did you get from one place to the next? Right? Did you succeed in moving through the space? Did you succeed in entering the building? Does it matter that you had a seeing eye dog? Does it matter that you had a wheelchair? Does it matter if the success is the same? And if actually what it turns out is we make our spaces based on the assumption of independence so much that we exclude people from being successful if they're not like that. But we could change that, right? You can build a ramp and suddenly a whole group of people succeed in entering your building without having to change anything about their body. That seems kind of awesome. Does that answer your question? Okay. Good.
We have one more that is written, but it's already kind of been answered. So, yes, Tim.
You gestured to this earlier when you were talking, when you answered Rachel's first question, I think. And I was wondering about how all of what you're saying here plays into basically the body-soul divide, like dualism. You can reference Descartes all the way back to Plato, right? But
Oh,
there's
yes.
a long tradition of
Yeah.
thinking that we are our souls, and I know you touched on this already, but I was wondering if there's a misreading of the soul-body relationship that you would ascribe to people maybe who don't understand disability the way they could. I guess I don't know.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Just elaborate on that.
Yeah, sure. What? Okay, so Tim was asking about something called the soul-body divide or dualism. If any of you, did any of you read Plato? Yeah, a few hands. Okay, so Plato, I love him. A common view attributed to Plato is something called dualism. Basically, we are a soul, and then we're sort of trapped in this body, right? And the goal is to get out of the body and to be the soul. And that really, on a Platonic view, that's like heaven, right? That's the ideal, perfect thing. And what he thought, so people say, is that we needed to just get out of the body as much as we could while we were alive. I don't actually think that's what Plato thought. But I'm not going to tell you all the reasons I think that, because I'm guessing they would bore most of you. But what I think I want to say is, so I really don't think that we are souls trapped in bodies. The technical term I applied to myself when it comes to thinking about human beings would be hylomorphism. So I think we are a compound of body and soul. But maybe the more beautiful way to say that is, I think you cannot be a human being without being embodied fundamentally. That what it is to be you is to be in a body. Now, in the resurrection, we know our bodies are going to be changed, but if we really were just souls, why would our bodies be resurrected? Why would that be a part of the story at all? Why would Jesus have been raised with his body if there wasn't something really fundamental about embodiment?
We're talking about Jesus and his human body in our Lent Super and Supper series, so ding ding. Yes, you have a question?
I have a question.
Yeah, and then you'll be the final word. How fitting.
It relates to Anna Lauren's question about our addiction to independence.
Yeah.
Many times, I know people who love helping others. They hate being helped. They say, I don't want to be a bother to anyone, or I don't want to be a burden to anyone. They will be the first to sign up for the meal train, but when they get sick, don't bring me food, or something like that. Or, I just, in church work all the time, I want to call people and visit when they get sick. You'd be amazed at how many times people say no.
Yeah.
You're so busy. I'm like, you're right. That vestry meeting is way more important than you. No, but this is the attitude often that people kind of have. And to Anna Lauren's point, being dependent on one another, to me, is something that strengthens the community. Where and why are we taught to be so independent that we want to reject help because it's seen as somehow less than? Where does that come from in your? I'm curious. I don't know.
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I don't know. I think there is a strong philosophical tradition that probably gets taught that says, along the lines of Descartes, somebody that you just mentioned, Tim, the best thing to do is like be able to go think in a room by yourself, which is a fundamentally solitary activity. I also think we love the idea of self-sufficiency. I think that's quite American. I think there's been an idea about that for quite a long time, that the thing we're supposed to do, if you think about the stories that get handed down in certain communities over and over and over, is a story about striking out on your own, getting there, scrabbling your way up or out, and that's success, that it's not really successful until it's you having done it self-sufficiently. And of course, the whole idea that one could really be self-sufficient seems kind of a myth to me, in part because the space that you're born in and the people that you're born to and the way that your life goes before you have really the kind of say in the choices that you make deeply shapes how your life goes for you. I don't think fundamentally or determinatively, but deeply shapes it, right? And so we are always in relationship to each other. Even when we're striking out from somewhere to do something new, we're doing it in contrast to the community that we're leaving. And so I think this whole idea that we're independent, I think there's just, I mean, maybe it goes back to the fall, to go back to that horrible question. No, it was a wonderful question that I couldn't answer. But maybe there's something there about a longing to do things self-sufficiently or by ourselves without being seen or known in community, that's what we're chasing. And switching that or changing that is hard and painful, but ultimately more beautiful.
The other thing, just this is going to be the final word, Anna, I'm sorry. We need to. The other thing, thinking about what you're saying, I was sicker than I've been in a long time. Some of you know this, in December. And I felt so vulnerable that the thought of anyone but my husband seeing me in that moment felt, it's not that I wanted to do it on my own because it was very clear my body wasn't going to allow that, but I felt incredibly vulnerable. And inviting people into that space felt really scary. So I wonder, it's pride in some ways, but I wonder if that's also part of it. All right, let's first thank Hilary, Dr. Hilary Yancey. Thank you. And then thank you, St. Albans and guests, for coming out. Speaking of my husband, he just texted me, and he wants you to know that it is very slippery outside. So please drive carefully. He said it's gotten a little more slick. But we hope to see you next year. Who knows what it'll be like next year? Yeah, and we'll be hanging around for a little bit if y'all have any further questions. Or you can contact me if you want Hilary's contact, and I can connect to you too. All right, thank you. Good night.